This painting is entitled The Last Correspondence of Ray Johnson. Ray Johnson was an artist in New York. He actually eventually lived in Sag Harbor, Long Island, who started writing to me in the late 80s, early 90s. I'd had a show in New York. I think I had my first show at PPOW in 1988. I showed with them for 25 years. Now I show with Miles McHenry Gallery, but at the time, I was showing with PPOW and getting some acclaim, some small, level of acclaim, and being written up in the magazines and stuff. But somehow along the way, Ray Johnson decided to start corresponding with me. I didn't know who he was. I had no idea who Ray Johnson was. He wrote me letters, and I thought they were a little weird. I thought they were pretty wacky. Things like, he would seal the envelope. He'd give me an envelope to send something back in, and I would seal it and send it back to him, and the next time he would send it back to me, and it would be an arrow, and it'd say Bo's Spit on it, like underneath the envelope flap. He would write that. And so, I was sort of freaked out, but it was a fun game to play with a stranger. I had no idea who he was, and so I played it quite a bit. I don't know how many letters we exchanged back and forth, but he would send something and say, add to it. Ray Johnson did a takeoff on it as he started to develop his own artistic career, where he would send stuff to famous artists. He would send it to he would send it to, Andy Warhol. He would send his letters to famous artists, and they would write back. And I guess he was in a circle of friends and people who knew who he was, or maybe they didn't, but he had this ongoing art-making process of sending letters back and forth in the U.S. mail. I remember one time I was working on I had a stack of his letters. I'd get mail, and I had a stack of mail that I was supposed to be responding to. And something happened, some gallery in New York told me they weren't going to show me, or I don't remember the exact circumstances. And I got mad, and I sort of threw some stuff, and it hit some turpentine and splattered all over the letters that I was supposed to be sending back, that I was supposed to respond to, and in his case, send back. But I eventually, just sent him the turpentine-soaked letter as my expression of my addition to it. And he wrote back, and he was like, so thorough in his response. He was like, oh, Bo got mad about something. It was wonderful. But then he sent me more images. Anyway, we worked off and on. I never knew who he was until he had passed. And when he died, he apparently at Sag Harbor sat on this guardrail and took his own life. He went into the water. And I I put the letter in the box here, like a little Cornell box. I put one of his correspondences with me. One of his last correspondences. It's called The Last Correspondence of Ray Johnson. And you see he lived in, his address here was Locust Valley. There's a great movie that's worth seeing if you haven't seen it. It's called How to Draw a Bunny. And it's a great documentary about Ray Johnson. But he loved the back and forth. He loved the exchange of energy and ideas and throwing something out there and letting somebody else respond to it. And that was the way he created his art, which, and there are plenty of people, luckily I kept mine because I keep everything. If I hadn't kept everything, I wouldn't have my Ray Johnson letters. There are people who have just hordes of, they spent much of their life and they knew who he was and they were responding with him. I would wait months and months in between sending things back just because I was busy. But I wanted that moment, and I showed it in New York. I showed this painting once in New York at PPOW, and someone came in and they said, oh, I knew Ray Johnson. That looks nothing like Ray Johnson. A portrait is, a likeness is, if you're a commercial or official portrait painter, the first thing that you want to capture is likeness, and the second thing is the soul and the spirit of the person. So this was not a commissioned portrait. I knew it didn't have to look anything like him, so I kept working on it until it had the feeling that for me, my experiences corresponding with Ray Johnson felt. It was a kind of, it's the sadness of what it means to be an artist, the aloneness and our calling out and our wanting connection with people, which is what art is. It's about communication, it's about language. Art is a language for communicating. And so I wanted him to have that feeling of wanting and release. I mean, he's definite in his next action. Ray Johnson is an artist, was an artist. He lived in the New York circle, New York artist. He wound up moving up to Long Island to Sag Harbor, which is where Locust Valley, but Sag Harbor is where he passed away. There's a sense to his posture to me that reminds me of the last scene of the film Breaker Morant. I don't know if you know this film. It was about the Boer War, about Australia. And so there's a scene where the main character at the very end goes before a firing squad. Spoiler alert. And so he's sitting there and he basically is accepting his fate. He had done the right thing, but because he was put up before the enemy tribunal, he was forced to sit there in a chair at sunrise, and the guys shoot him and his companion. So there's an aspect to the pose, to me, that feels like the last scene in Breaker Morant, where he's sitting and he's sort of accepting something. Suicide is a complex thing, and I'm sure there was a sense of loneliness that was going on in him. But there was also a sense of that he had sort of figured it out in a way, like he had figured it out. I'm not saying that that's a healthy response to having figured it out, but it's like, it was almost like his last and greatest art piece was that action of I can disappear. And that's part of my art. And that's, I think, part of what this is about. So there was meant to be a very complex series of emotions going on in the physiognomy, and all of that has to do with the whole creative process and an acceptance of the creative process and how we have to let it go, and we have to engage, and then we have to have some sort of resolve, which all has to do with dissolving of the ego at some point.